When white cops target a black woman, they had no idea who she really was. It was a regular evening. The city streets buzzed with the usual sounds. Cars honking, people chatting, and the occasional siren. But for Mariah, this night would be anything but ordinary. Little did she know, the moment she stepped outside would change the course of her life forever. As she walked, her heart beat steadily in her chest, a rhythm she had grown accustomed to. A woman of grace, strength, and wisdom far beyond her years. She had learned to navigate the world with a fierce determination. She wasn't just anyone walking down that street. She was Mariah, a woman who carried generations of stories and struggles in her soul. Mariah, like so many others, had faced injustice, prejudice, and discrimination her whole life. But tonight, her story would reveal something much more powerful than they ever expected. The police car pulled up beside her, sirens blaring, lights flashing. The officer's eyes met her, and without hesitation, they demanded her to stop. "Excuse me, miss," the officer called, stepping out of the vehicle, his tone sharp. "Can you explain what you're doing here?" Mariah's pulse quickened, but she didn't flinch. She'd faced this before. "I'm just walking home," she said calmly, her voice steady, even though her mind raced. "Is there a problem, officer?" One of the officers eyed her suspiciously, his gaze narrowing. "You don't belong here." Those words, they weren't new to Mariah. She had heard them before, felt them before, as though her existence was never quite welcome in places meant to be open. The officer's words, though painful, were familiar, a reminder of the world's constant bias. "What do you mean, I don't belong here?" Mariah asked, her voice now tinged with frustration. "This is my neighborhood." But they weren't hearing her. They didn't care. As the officer reached for his radio, the tension in the air thickened. Mariah felt the familiar weight of fear wash over her. But there was something else too. A burning sense of injustice, a desire to fight back not just for herself, but for every person who had been treated like this before her. The officer's hand rested on his holstered gun, the cold metal a silent threat. It wasn't the first time she had felt the sharp edge of fear under the weight of authority. The weight of being judged simply for existing in the skin she was born into. But Mariah wasn't just any black woman walking alone on the street. She was a force to be reckoned with, and that was something they were about to find out. Beneath the surface of this moment, there was an untold story, one that had been simmering, waiting for the right time to emerge. Years of injustice, inequality, and untold pain had shaped who she was. Her story wasn't just hers to tell. It was a story shared by countless women before her. Women who had fought silently, uncelebrated through history's darkest hours. They had risen, they had endured, and now so was she. As the officer stepped closer, his eyes still fixed on her, he didn't realize who he was dealing with. He didn't know the strength that pulsed through her veins, the courage that emanated from her soul. He didn't know the history of resilience, of power, of brilliance that lived in her. He didn't know the fighter who would not back down, no matter how many times the world tried to silence her. He didn't know Mariah was a descendant of queens, of warriors, of trailblazers. He didn't know the books she had read, the wisdom she had gathered, or the battles she had fought, both on the outside and within herself. He didn't know the lessons she had learned from women who had been told they were not enough, yet stood tall, unapologetically claiming their space in this world. And in that moment, when he reached for his radio to call for backup, something inside Mariah clicked. She wasn't going to be just another story. She wasn't going to be another headline. She was a woman with a mission, a woman whose voice had the power to shift the tide of this moment and many others like it. As the second officer approached, he asked her once more, "Are you sure you live here?" Mariah's heart swelled, not with anger, but with quiet strength. She straightened her back, stood tall, and met their eyes with the unyielding gaze of someone who knew her worth. Someone who had learned that the system may try to break you, but you decide whether you stand or fall. Her voice broke the silence like thunder, strong and certain. "I'm a black woman," she said, her words resonating with the weight of history. "And I am not afraid of you. Not today, not ever." The officers faltered for a split second, unsure of what to say, unsure of how to respond to the sheer force of a woman who refused to be intimidated. But Mariah wasn't done. "You've targeted me," she continued, her voice steady as ever, "because of the color of my skin. But you don't know me. You don't know the struggles I've faced, the obstacles I've overcome. You don't know the strength I carry with me everywhere I go." Her words hung in the air, a challenge they couldn't ignore. With each passing moment, the officers began to realize the mistake they had made. But it wasn't just a mistake about her. It was a mistake that echoed through the generations. This was a story that was far bigger than one moment, bigger than one woman standing up for herself. This was the story of countless others, women who had fought not only for their own rights but for the rights of every person who had ever felt the sting of discrimination. Mariah wasn't just a target tonight. She was the embodiment of every black woman who had ever been mistreated, misunderstood, or misjudged. She was the manifestation of all the strength and resilience of those who had fought before her. The officers, now recognizing the gravity of the situation, began to back down. But Mariah's words remained with them, etched into their minds. This was more than just an encounter, it was a reckoning. As she walked away, her steps were firm. The officers never apologized, but in the silence that followed, they had learned something valuable. You can't judge a book by its cover, and you can't judge a black woman by her skin. Mariah's presence alone was a testament to that truth. She wasn't just walking home. She was walking with history. She was walking with power. She was walking with purpose. And the world would never be the same again. As Mariah continued walking, the city around her seemed to shift. The noise, the distractions, the flickering lights, it all blurred into the background. In the midst of the chaos, her thoughts began to settle. The adrenaline still pulsed through her veins, but beneath it was something else. An understanding. A deep understanding of the journey ahead, of the work that still needed to be done. She knew this fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. For years, Mariah had experienced this. The subtle looks, the whispers, the momentary flashes of fear in people's eyes when they saw her. A black woman, standing tall and confident. But each time, she refused to let the weight of their judgment define her. She had learned that her power was in her resilience. Her power was in her refusal to shrink. As she walked down the street, her mind wandered back to the stories her mother used to tell her. Stories of strength, of survival, of people who had fought for their place in a world that constantly tried to push them down. The ancestors she carried within her heart had faced unimaginable hardships, but they had survived. They had thrived. And now she was a part of that same story. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "You carry the legacy of the strong women who came before you. You are a queen, and don't you ever forget it." Those words had always stayed with her, but tonight, they felt different. They felt more real, more urgent. They weren't just words. They were a call to action. Mariah turned a corner, the familiar sights of her neighborhood now in front of her. It was a quiet street with small houses lined up along the sidewalk. But there was a warmth here, a sense of community that couldn't be shaken by the outside world. In this neighborhood, she wasn't just another face. She was family. She smiled as she passed Mrs. Johnson's house, where the elderly woman always sat on her porch in the evenings, waiting to greet anyone who passed by. Mrs. Johnson had always been a beacon of kindness and wisdom in the community. She knew everyone's name, and her heart was as big as the sky. As Mariah waved, Mrs. Johnson smiled back, her eyes lighting up with recognition. "How you doing, girl?" Mrs. Johnson called out. "I'm good, Mrs. Johnson. Just another day in the life," Mariah replied with a smile. But beneath her words was the weight of everything that had happened. "Don't let those folks get to you, baby. You got it in you to rise above it all," Mrs. Johnson said, her voice full of warmth and knowing. Mariah paused for a moment, letting the wisdom sink in. "Thanks, Mrs. Johnson. You're right." She wasn't sure if Mrs. Johnson had seen what had happened earlier, but the old woman's words hit close to home. There was always someone watching, someone who understood, someone who cared, and that mattered. It mattered more than the anger she had felt earlier. It mattered more than the injustice she had faced. As Mariah continued walking, she felt the weight of the world slowly lifting from her shoulders. She was not alone. She was never alone. There were countless people just like her, people who had faced the same struggles, the same battles, and together they would rise. But there was something more that Mariah knew deep down. This was not just her fight. This was a fight for every black woman who had ever been dismissed, belittled, or misunderstood. This was a fight for every black woman who had ever been silenced by society's expectations of what she should be. Mariah knew her journey wasn't just about reclaiming her own dignity. It was about reclaiming the dignity of every black woman who had ever been told she was less than, who had ever been pushed aside, whose voice had been drowned out by the noise of a world that didn't want to listen. Her steps quickened. She wasn't just walking home. She was walking towards something greater. As she approached her house, she could see her mother sitting on the porch, a familiar figure bathed in the soft glow of the porch light. Her mother had always been a pillar of strength for her, a woman who had never let life's struggles break her. Her mother had taught her how to stand tall, how to fight for what was right, and how to never back down from what she believed in. Mariah could see the concern in her mother's eyes as she stood up and walked toward her. But there was something else there too. Something softer, something understanding. "You all right, baby?" her mother asked, her voice gentle but strong. Mariah nodded, though she could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her. "Yeah, Mom. I'm good." Her mother didn't buy it. "I can see it in your eyes. What happened?" Mariah took a deep breath. She could feel the tears welling up inside her, but she swallowed them down. There was a time for tears, and then there was a time for action. Tonight it was time for action. "They pulled me over," Mariah said, her voice steady, but her hands clenched into fists at her sides. "They didn't even give me a chance to explain myself. They just assumed I didn't belong." Her mother's eyes darkened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she wrapped her arms around Mariah, holding her tightly. "I know, baby. I know." Mariah closed her eyes, letting her mother's embrace calm her racing thoughts. She had never realized how much she needed this, how much she needed the strength of her mother to hold her up when the world felt like it was too heavy to carry. "I didn't back down, though," Mariah said, pulling away slightly to look her mother in the eye. "I told them who I was. I told them I wasn't afraid." Her mother smiled, her eyes filled with pride. "That's my girl." Mariah sat down next to her mother, the two of them in silence for a moment. The world outside seemed so distant, so irrelevant in this quiet moment. But inside her, the fire that had been ignited earlier was still burning. The fight wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "This is just the beginning," Mariah said, her voice filled with a quiet determination. "I'm not going to let this go. I'm not going to let them win." Her mother nodded. "And you shouldn't. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all of us. For every woman who's ever been told she's not enough." Mariah looked at her mother, and in that moment, she knew. She wasn't just a black woman standing alone in the world. She was part of something bigger. She was part of a legacy of resilience, of strength, of women who had fought and bled and sacrificed so that the next generation could stand taller. As the night wore on, Mariah knew that tomorrow would be different. She wasn't going to let fear or hate dictate her life. She was going to rise. She was going to keep walking one step at a time toward the future she wanted to see. A future where no black woman would ever have to feel less than. A future where every woman's voice would be heard. And as she sat there, with her mother by her side, she made a promise to herself. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to thrive. She was going to show the world that black women were powerful, unstoppable forces to be reckoned with. This was her fight. This was her time.